The sun beat down like a hammer on the endless stretch of sand and rock, every grain scorching against her skin as if the desert itself was alive and punishing her. She stumbled over jagged stones, her boots worn to tatters, lips cracked and dry. Ash! And every step felt like walking through fire. The wind carried a bitter taste of dust and heat, and somewhere, far off, a vulture circled, its shadow slicing the barren land. She had thought the journey west would bring freedom, a new life away from the shadowed past she carried, but the desert had no mercy. It had claimed countless souls before her, and now she feared she might join them. Her vision blurred. Sweat burned her eyes. She fell to her knees, the weight of the sun pressing her to the sand, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. She tried to remember why she had left, what she had hoped to find out here. But the memories slipped like water through her fingers. Faces of strangers and loved ones mingled in her mind, but they felt distant, unreal, as if she had lived those moments in someone else's life. Panic clawed at her chest, and she gasped for air that was heavy with heat and sorrow. Somewhere deep inside, she knew she was close to the edge between life and a silence so deep it swallowed everything whole. And then darkness came. She could feel it like a blanket, cold and endless, folding over her, pulling her away from the burning sky and the cruel desert. She surrendered to it, letting her body fall, letting her soul drift. If there was any hope left, it had faded with the sun, leaving only the barren emptiness. But death, she would soon learn, had a strange way of bending reality. She awoke to the smell of smoke and the low hum of voices in a tongue she didn't understand. Her eyes opened to dim firelight flickering against rough wooden walls. God. And she felt a heaviness she didn't remember, a mix of fear and confusion pressing down like stones on her chest. Her hands were tied with soft but firm leather. She realized she was lying on something that smelled of earth and animal hide. Her heart pounded in her ears as she tried to sit up, and then she saw him. He was unlike anyone she had ever met. Broad-shouldered, with skin like burnished copper and eyes sharp as flint, he watched her with a calm intensity that made her skin prickle. He was quiet, but in his silence there was a command that demanded attention. Every movement he made was deliberate, measured, almost predatory, as if he were sizing her up, testing her for weaknesses she didn't know she had. And yet, beneath the steel of his gaze, there was a strange kind of patience, as if he had waited a long time for this moment. "You were awake," said in a voice low and smooth, but she didn't understand the words. She could only watch as his lips moved, the firelight catching the planes of his face, and the deep power in his presence sent a chill through her. Her mind spun, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to remember the desert, the heat, the suffocating darkness, and the sudden, inexplicable safety she felt under his watchful eyes. He gestured to someone behind him, and a woman appeared, her movements careful, almost reverent. The woman's expression was unreadable, her eyes cautious, yet not unkind. She brought water in a bowl of carved wood. The liquid cooled against the dryness of her lips, and finally she could swallow without choking. The silence between them stretched, tense and suffocating, and though she wanted to speak, the words stuck in her throat. She had no name here, no place, no memory of how she had come to be in this strange, unforgiving world. The chief, the man who had appeared to hold power over everything in this place, circled her slowly, like a predator inspecting its prey, though she couldn't be sure if he intended harm or protection. "You are far from where you should be," he said again, and this time she caught the meaning. Though the words themselves were alien, his eyes locked onto hers, sharp and unrelenting, as if he were searching her soul for some hidden truth. She realized with a mix of fear and fascination that she had been brought here for a reason, though she didn't yet know what it was. Outside, the wind whispered against the walls of the hut, carrying faint echoes of the desert she thought she had left behind. She remembered the sun, the pain, the hopeless march through sand and rock and the darkness that had claimed her. She shivered, unsure if she had truly survived or if this new life was something else entirely. Something between dream and reality, death and life. The chief finally spoke again, and though she didn't understand the words, The tone was unmistakable. Command, expectation, and then, slowly, as if revealing a secret meant only for her, he touched her hand. The weight of it was astonishing, and it left her trembling. She had never felt so exposed, so seen, yet so inexplicably safe. It was terrifying and magnetic at the same time. A rush of questions surged through her, but fear anchored them. Who was he? Why had he saved her, or brought her here? And why, in the depths of her exhaustion and confusion, did a small, rebellious part of her heart feel drawn to him? She had thought the desert would be the end of her story, the final chapter of a life marked by loss and wandering, and yet here she was, thrust into something she didn't understand. Under the watchful gaze of a man who seemed as untamed and dangerous as the land itself, she tried to move, to speak, to demand answers, but her voice failed her. Her body felt foreign, unsteady, as if it belonged to someone else. And as the fire flickered, casting shadows across the walls and across his face, she realized that nothing here would be easy. She was caught between worlds, the one she had lost in the desert and the one she had awoken into. Strange, raw, and perilous. The chief knelt slightly, close enough for her to see the fine scars on his hands and the quiet intensity in his eyes. The firelight danced across his features, and she noticed the subtle curve of a smile, barely there, that made her heart stutter. She didn't know whether to trust it or fear it, but she could feel its power twisting through the silence. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, promises, threats she couldn't yet interpret. And then the woman from before returned, carrying something wrapped in cloth. The chief gestured to her, and the bundle was placed beside her. She hesitated, curiosity warring with caution. Whatever it was, it seemed to hold importance. A key to understanding why she had been brought here, or perhaps a test of her courage. She reached out, hands trembling, and when she unfolded the cloth, her breath caught. The desert, the sun, and the endless march had brought her to this moment. To this strange new life, where survival was only the beginning. She had died in the heat, but here, in the flickering light of the fire, in the weight of the chief's gaze, she realized that life had not abandoned her. Instead, it had offered her a path she could not yet comprehend, a path that would demand everything from her, heart, mind, and spirit. And as the shadows deepened around the hut, and the fire hissed with sudden sparks, she felt it, the first flicker of fear, of wonder, and of a bond she could not yet name. She was far from home, far from the life she had known, and yet she could not look away from the man whose presence both terrified and captivated her. She understood, without knowing how, that her story was only beginning. The desert had taken her once, but now it had placed her somewhere dangerous, somewhere wild, somewhere alive, somewhere that would change everything. And in that moment, with the fire crackling, the chief watching her with unyielding eyes, and the wind carrying the distant cries of the desert, she realized she was not just surviving. She was being claimed. Her next breath caught in her throat as a thought sank deep, heavy and undeniable. She was no longer simply a wanderer lost in the desert. She was now the wife of a man whose power was absolute, whose world was ruthless, and whose heart she could not yet understand. And whether she would endure it or be consumed by it, she did not yet know. The desert outside waited, patient and unforgiving, while inside a new life hung in fragile, dangerous balance. The night pressed close, filled with secrets, danger, and the impossible promise of something more. She could only wait, trembling, for what tomorrow might bring. The night stretched on, long and unbroken, while the desert wind whispered against the walls of the hut, carrying with it the faint sounds of coyotes and distant rattlesnakes. She could hear the occasional crackle of the fire, the shifting of feet on the hard-packed earth, and the low hum of voices in a language she could not understand. Her mind refused to rest. Sleep was a fragile thing that came and went, replaced by a relentless stream of questions that gnawed at her. She had survived the desert, yes, but the unknown she now faced felt far more dangerous than the sun-scorched sands ever could. She had been brought here for a reason. She was sure of it. That much was certain from the way the chief's eyes had followed her every movement, like he could see every thought before it fully formed. There was an authority about him that made the air in the hut feel thick, heavy, almost sacred. She tried to remember what she had learned from old stories, what she had read about the Apache and the lands they roamed. She knew only the surface, the legends of fearless warriors, of fierce loyalty, of lives carved out from the wild. But nothing she had read could prepare her for the reality of Himtha, man whose very presence demanded her attention, whose silence spoke louder than words ever could. Her mind drifted, trying to piece together how she had ended up here. The desert had been unforgiving, relentless. Each step westward had felt like an escape, a desperate search for something she didn't yet understand. She had left behind a life that had felt suffocating, leaving only fragments of herself in the dust and sun. The memory of collapsing among the rocks, unable to feel her legs, had haunted her, and she had assumed that was the end. Yet somehow, she had woken alive, or something like it, in a world that was entirely new, yet frighteningly familiar in its harshness. The chief moved silently, tending to a small fire in a corner of the hut. His hands were steady, precise, and though she could not read his expression fully, she felt the weight of thought behind every motion. There was strategy in his movements, an almost imperceptible awareness of everything around him. The way he watched her, measured her responses. It all spoke of a man who had survived countless battles, who had made choices that left scars both visible and hidden. She realized that this was not a man who wasted time. Nothing here was random. She had been brought here intentionally, with purpose. And that realization sent a chill down her spine. The woman who had brought her water earlier lingered near the doorway, her posture cautious, her gaze flicking between the chief and herself. There was an air of familiarity between them, something unspoken that suggested a long history of shared experience. She wondered if the woman was a guide, a protector, or perhaps even a keeper of secrets she could not yet comprehend. Every detail in the room seemed significant, from the arrangement of the firewood to the patterns carved into the wooden walls. She could feel the weight of tradition pressing down on her, something older than the desert itself, something that demanded respect and caution. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she began to notice other details. A few crude but carefully made weapons leaned against the walls. A blanket woven with intricate designs was draped over a bench. Small symbols, carved into wood and stone, seemed to form a language she could not decipher. Yet they spoke of ritual, of history, of things much larger than her own fleeting life. She realized that she had stepped into a world that was both beautiful and dangerous, one where survival depended on understanding rules she had never been taught, and instincts she didn't yet trust. The chief's voice broke the silence again. Though she did not understand the words, the tone was different this time, less commanding, almost curious. He approached her slowly, and she could feel the intensity of his gaze, the way it seemed to weigh her against some invisible standard. He stopped a few feet away, his presence filling the small space, and she could not help but notice the power in his posture. The way his body moved, as if every muscle remembered years of battle and hardship. She felt both exposed and strangely alive under his attention. Tension she could not name but could not ignore. Hours seemed to pass, though she could not be certain. The desert outside was a vast black emptiness, broken only by the faint glimmer of stars. She could hear the occasional distant cry of an animal, a reminder that life here was raw, untamed, and often unforgiving. She thought of the sun that had scorched her skin, of the heat that had driven her to the brink, and realized that the desert was not done with her yet. It had brought her here, yes, but survival was only the first step. Understanding this new life, this new world, would be far harder. Her mind wandered back to the day she had left home. The hurried packing of supplies, the farewell whispered to no one who could follow. She had sought freedom. She had sought control over her own destiny, and now lying on this rough bed of earth and hide. With her body aching and her spirit unsettled, she began to understand the price of that freedom. Here, she was not in control. Every action, every glance, every breath was observed, measured, and judged. And yet, despite the fear, there was a pull. a magnetic tension that drew her toward him, the chief, in ways she could neither predict nor resist. There was a story here. She realized one she did not yet know fully. The chief had his past, his battles, his losses. The woman who tended to her had hers. And she herself was a stranger, plucked from the desert sands and thrust into a world of rules she had never learned. She sensed alliances forming, invisible threads connecting the people around her, threads that could protect or destroy her depending on how she navigated them. Each moment in the hut was a test, each look a challenge, and she could feel the tension building with every passing second. The chief finally turned away from the fire, moving toward the doorway as if to signal the end of this first encounter. She felt a pang of loss, as if the moment of connection, the fragile, dangerous understanding, was slipping from her grasp. She wanted to speak, to ask 100 questions. But the words seemed trapped behind some unseen barrier, silenced by fear and the weight of the unknown. He paused at the doorway, glanced back once, and in that instant she understood that the night was far from over, that this encounter was only the beginning. Outside, the desert loomed, vast and endless. The wind carried with it the scent of sand and sage, the promise of danger, and the echo of lives long gone. She could feel it pressing against the walls of the hut, a reminder that survival here was never certain. And inside, the fire flickered, casting shifting shadows that seemed to dance with secrets, with warnings. With stories waiting to be told, she closed her eyes briefly, trying to calm her racing heart, and in the silence, she felt the truth settle deep in her bones. This was not just a place of refuge. This was a world ruled by power, by instinct, by history written in scars and blood and fire. And she was a part of it now, whether she wanted to be or not. The woman brought her another bowl of water, her eyes wary but steady. The chief remained at the doorway, his presence a constant weight, a silent promise and threat intertwined. She drank slowly, feeling the cool liquid soothe some of the fire in her throat. But it was not enough to ease the tension coiling inside her. She realized that every moment in this place demanded attention, demanded awareness, demanded a strength she was only beginning to understand she possessed. Night deepened, and still the chief did not speak more than a few words. His silence was deliberate, commanding, and in that silence, she could hear the rhythm of the desert itself, the way it waited, patient and indifferent, shaping those who survived. She understood now that this was a test, a beginning of a journey far more dangerous than any she had ever imagined. The desert had nearly claimed her, but now a new challenge awaited, one that would test her mind, her courage, and perhaps even her heart. As the wind howled softly outside and the fire cast shadows that seemed almost alive, she realized that nothing in this world was simple. Survival was only the first step. Understanding would be the next. And trust, if it could be found at all, would be the most dangerous challenge of all. Her eyes met the chief's one final time before he left, and she saw there the promise of danger, the weight of history, and a glimpse of something she could not yet name. She felt a thrill, sharp and undeniable, and a fear that knotted her stomach. She was trapped in a new world, a life she had never imagined, bound to a man whose power was absolute and whose secrets were countless. And somewhere deep inside, she knew the story had only just begun. The desert had brought her to the edge. And now, this world, the fire, the shadows, the chief was about to teach her that every choice, every breath, every heartbeat would be a battle. She could only wait and watch, her senses alert, her spirit trembling for what was to come next. The night pressed on, endless and thick, while outside, the desert waited patiently, and inside a life hung in balance, fragile and uncertain, ready to shift in ways she could not yet imagine. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, spilling a pale, burning light across the jagged peaks and shifting sands of the desert. Its glow found her still in the hut, wrapped in the rough blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and earth. The night had passed in restless tension, filled with half-formed dreams of heat and sand, of the chief's piercing gaze, and of a life that seemed impossibly far behind her. Each moment she had spent awake had been a battle of its own, trying to make sense of the strange world she now inhabited. Of the people whose lives were so tightly bound to the unforgiving land, the chief was already awake, seated near the fire. Sharpening a knife with careful, precise strokes, every motion seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. She could feel the weight of his presence pressing on her, silent and unyielding. His eyes, dark and steady, occasionally flicked toward her, a silent measurement of her movements, her strength, her very will to survive. She knew instinctively that he was the kind of man who did not tolerate weakness, who expected those around him to endure and to adapt, or to vanish quietly like so many others the desert had claimed. The woman who had been tending to her the night before moved quietly about the hut, gathering supplies, speaking softly in the Apache tongue. She had not yet offered her name. And in the way she moved, there was a cautious authority, a knowledge of the chief's moods and expectations, and a keen awareness of the danger that lingered in every shadow. She seemed to be a bridge between the chief and the world outside. It's a figure who could guide, protect, or perhaps manipulate. She did not yet know which. After a long moment, the chief spoke. The words were foreign, carried on a tone of command that brooked no argument. Yet beneath it, she sensed a curiosity, a desire to understand her as much as to control her. She did not know what he was asking, but the force behind it made her pulse quicken. Every glance, every subtle movement felt loaded with significance, as if the desert and its harsh rules had been distilled into the man before her. She realized, with a jolt, that understanding him, or at least surviving him, would demand more from her than she had ever imagined. The hut's small space seemed to contract under the tension between them. She felt the weight of history, of countless battles, of traditions carved from hardship pressing against her chest. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, a reminder of life and death in their purest, rawest forms. The wind whistled faintly against the wooden walls, carrying whispers of sand and time, and she imagined the countless lives that had been shaped, broken, and claimed by this same harsh land. She had survived the desert once, barely, but here survival meant more than endurance. It meant reading the subtle cues, anticipating danger, and navigating a world she did not yet understand. Later, she was led outside. The sunlight was fierce, blinding after the dim shadows of the hut. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, jagged and relentless, and she felt small, insignificant, yet alive in a way that terrified her. The chief walked beside her, silent, his presence a constant pressure. Every step seemed measured, deliberate, a rhythm she was only beginning to feel. Around them, members of the tribe moved with fluid precision, their eyes sharp, alert, and watchful. It was a world she had read about in stories, a world of danger and honor, loyalty and power, but seeing it in motion, feeling its pulse, was nothing like she had imagined. She was shown the living quarters, the communal spaces, and the areas where the tribe's leaders gathered to plan and strategize. The chief's position was clear. He was both a guardian and a ruler, a man whose decisions shaped the lives of everyone around him. Yet there was tension here too. She could feel the unspoken rivalries, the subtle challenges, the quiet arguments simmering beneath the surface. Even within the tribe, power was never absolute, and she began to understand that her presence had already altered the delicate balance. The chief's decision to bring her into this world had consequences, some she could not yet perceive. The woman who had been her caretaker took her aside and spoke, slowly, carefully, pointing to areas of the camp, explaining small customs with gestures and simple words she could begin to understand. It was a tentative education, a glimpse into a life that demanded attention and discipline. She learned the significance of certain symbols etched into wood, the meaning behind the patterns woven into blankets, and the subtle hierarchy that governed interactions among the tribe. Each lesson, though simple on the surface, carried weight, and she realized quickly that ignorance here was dangerous. A single misstep could provoke anger, suspicion, or worse. That evening, the chief called a gathering. The tribe assembled in a circle near the fire, the scent of sage and burning wood filling the air. She watched as he spoke, gesturing, issuing commands, and receiving reports. Though she could not understand the language, she understood the rhythm of authority, the interplay of loyalty and challenge. Some nodded with respect, some with cautious hesitation, and a few shifted uneasily under his gaze. It was a delicate balance of power, and she sensed the tension, the fear, the loyalty, the unspoken rivalries that pulsed like a living thing. Later, the chief approached her alone. His eyes were steady, unreadable, and she felt a pull she could not resist. He spoke again, his words incomprehensible, but the tone carried meaning. There was warning in it, a subtle thread of expectation, as a suggestion that she would have a role to play. A part in this world she barely understood. The weight of it pressed on her chest. Survival was no longer enough. She would have to navigate loyalty, fear, and desire, all intertwined in ways that were both dangerous and intoxicating. As the night deepened, she could hear the distant howls of wolves, a reminder that the desert's dangers extended beyond human conflicts. The chief remained nearby, a constant silent presence. The wind carried the scent of dust and smoke, of earth and life, and she realized she was on the edge of everything, life and death, loyalty and betrayal, freedom and confinement. She felt the tension coil inside her like a living thing, aware that her every move would now carry weight, consequence, scrutiny. The following days were filled with lessons both practical and subtle. She learned to read the desert, to notice the tracks of animals, to understand the ways the wind could carry sound and scent. She learned the routines of the tribe, the unspoken rules, and the way power shifted subtly from one person to another. The chief watched, always watching, and she felt the duality of his presence, a man capable of mercy and ferocity in equal measure, a ruler whose decisions could protect or destroy in a heartbeat. Every interaction with him was a test, every glance a challenge, every silence a measure of her courage. She began to notice the subplots, the smaller tensions that ran through the tribe like hidden currents. A young warrior watched the chief with envy and ambition, his pride bristling beneath the surface. A mother with a sharp tongue whispered warnings to others, her loyalty uncertain. Even the elders carried grudges, their eyes wary, their words measured. Each person had a place, a story, a hidden motive. And she realized that navigating this world would require far more than simple obedience. She would need instinct, perception, and courage, traits she did not yet fully trust in herself. One evening, she was called to help with preparations for a journey. The chief had plans, he made it clear, and her role, though not fully explained, was vital. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with anticipation and uncertainty. She felt a thrill of fear mixed with determination. She had survived the desert, but surviving this world required more than endurance. It required understanding, strategy, and the ability to act when the moment demanded it. As the tribe gathered, the firelight flickered across their faces, highlighting the sharp lines of tension, the careful glances, and the weight of unspoken thoughts. The chief addressed them, issuing instructions, his tone firm, commanding. Yet there was an underlying urgency that she could feel, even without understanding the words. The desert beyond waited, harsh and unrelenting, and every decision mattered. One wrong step, one failure to read the signs, could mean disaster for all of them. She realized as she watched him that the chief's world was built on a fragile balance. The desert had shaped him, forged him into a man of precision and power. But it had also left cracks, vulnerabilities hidden beneath layers of strength and command. And in that realization, she saw a path, a glimmer of possibility, but also a danger she could not yet fully measure. Her survival, her future, and perhaps her very life were intertwined with this man in the world he ruled, a world where loyalty was tested. Danger was constant, and the desert itself could swallow the unprepared. As night fell and the stars began to pierce the dark sky, she stood beside the fire, aware of every shadow, every movement, every breath of wind. The desert loomed outside, silent and patient, while within the circle of the tribe, tension rippled like an unseen current. She understood that her journey was only beginning. But the conflicts surrounding the chief, the tribe, and the unforgiving land were far from resolved. She could feel the threads of stories, loyalties, and rivalries winding around her, tightening like a trap, and yet she could not look away. Her heart beat fast with anticipation, with fear, with curiosity. She had survived the desert, but now she faced a far more complex challenge, surviving a world of power, history, and human ambition that moved as swiftly and unpredictably as the sandstorms beyond the camp. And as the chief's eyes found hers across the firelight, steady, unreadable, she understood that the stakes were higher than anything she had ever imagined. The desert had given her life, but this world would demand everything she had to offer, and perhaps more than she could give. And in that knowledge, the tension deepened, coiling around her like the wind that swept through the desert, carrying secrets, threats, and the promise of a story far from finished. She could only wait, watch, and learn, for the battles seen and unseen were just beginning. And the chief's world held dangers she was only beginning to understand. If you want, I can continue with the next section, diving into more detailed subplots, alliances, rivalries within the tribe, and hints of the chief's past to keep the suspense and mystery building further. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale light over the desert when the camp stirred with a tension that felt almost electric. She could feel it in the air, a thick, uneasy energy that made her stomach twist and her heart beat faster. The chief moved among his people with quiet authority, his gaze sharp and unyielding, measuring every face, every gesture, every flicker of doubt or defiance. Even without understanding the language fully, she could feel the weight of command in his presence, the invisible threads of power that bound everyone to him. Threads she was now caught in. She had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the tribe, to the unspoken rules and the subtle hierarchy, yet today felt different. There was a sense of urgency, an undercurrent of danger that made the air itself seem heavy. The younger warriors whispered in hushed tones, glancing toward the chief and then at each other, their faces taut with concern. Some movements were deliberate, cautious, measured as if every step could spark a confrontation or provoke disaster. She felt her pulse quicken with the knowledge that something was about to happen, something that could change everything, and she had no control over it. The chief called a meeting in the open courtyard, a space surrounded by sun-baked earth and stone, the desert stretching endlessly beyond. The entire tribe gathered, forming a circle around him, and the tension was palpable. Even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath. She watched as he spoke, issuing commands in the Apache tongue. And though the words were alien, the weight behind them was unmistakable. Some nodded, others shifted uneasily, and a few glared at one another with thinly veiled hostility. The balance of power was delicate, precarious, and she could feel it teetering on the edge of chaos. The woman who had become her guide stood beside her, whispering simple explanations, cautioning her not to move too abruptly, not to draw attention, not to speak. Each word, each gesture carried importance she had to respect. She realized that even a small misstep could have consequences far beyond what she had imagined, and the thought sent a chill racing through her. She had survived the desert, but surviving here required more than endurance. It demanded perception, instinct, and the ability to act under pressure she could barely understand. As the morning passed, rumors of approaching danger began to circulate among the tribe. Scouts had spotted a rival group, a band known for raiding and for bringing chaos wherever they went. The chief listened, silent and unreadable, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. He gave orders swiftly, with an economy of movement and speech that left no room for error. The tribe responded immediately, preparing weapons, securing the camp, and moving with a precision that spoke of years of discipline and training. She could feel the tension building like a coiled spring, every heartbeat quickened by the knowledge that confrontation was inevitable. She was called to assist in preparations, a task she did not fully understand, but performed with care. Every movement was observed, measured, judged. The chief's eyes found hers more than once, and she felt the familiar pull, the magnetic tension that had been present since the day she had awakened in this strange world. She could feel both fear and fascination. The knowledge that she was both an outsider and someone who now mattered in ways she had never expected. Every step, every gesture carried weight, and she realized that the desert had been only the first trial. This looming conflict was something far more dangerous. It's far more immediate. By midday, the rival group was closer, and scouts returned with detailed reports. The chief gathered his closest warriors, discussing strategy with intensity that left no room for doubt. She could see the respect, fear, and loyalty in the eyes of the men around him. And she felt the undercurrent of some were eager for battle, some cautious, some questioning, but all bound to the chief's will in ways she could not yet fully grasp. The desert beyond waited, indifferent to their plans, its harshness a reminder that survival depended on skill, courage, and sometimes sheer luck. She watched as the chief prepared for what was coming, noting the subtle signs of tension in his posture, the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the hilt of his knife. This was a man who had seen violence and survived, who carried scars both visible and hidden, yet she sensed a depth of concern beneath the control. He was a ruler, a warrior, a protector, and perhaps a man whose own past would collide with the present in ways she could not yet predict. The tribe moved with urgency, securing the perimeter, ensuring that every detail was attended to. She followed cautiously, carrying water and supplies, her senses alert. Every shadow, every movement in the sand, every whisper of the wind felt significant. She realized that even the smallest mistake could be fatal. The desert had taught her survival, but here she needed more: intuition, courage, and an understanding of the complex web of loyalties that bound these people together. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the camp, the scouts returned with news that the rival group had split, approaching from multiple directions. The chief's face remained calm, but she could see the tension coiled beneath the surface. Plans were adjusted swiftly, and the warriors moved into position with silent efficiency. She could hear her own heartbeat loud in her ears. As the desert seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash, the night brought a strange, tense stillness. Fires burned low, casting flickering shadows that seemed to twist and move like living things. She could hear the faint sounds of the desert, the rustle of sand, the distant cry of coyotes, the whisper of wind through rock formations. Every sound felt amplified, every movement significant. She sensed the fear and anticipation in the tribe and in the chief, a quiet determination that radiated authority and power. She was aware, more than ever, that she was part of something larger than herself, that the coming hours would demand more than she had ever given. A sudden commotion from the scouts brought her attention to the edge of the camp. Figures moved in the dim light, shadows shifting across the desert floor. The rival group was closer than expected, and the chief's warriors prepared, tightening their grips on weapons, moving silently into position. She felt the tension coil tighter in her chest, a mixture of fear, excitement, and an awareness that the moment of truth was near. She could see the chief's eyes scanning the horizon, reading the desert with a skill born of years. A silent command flowing from him to his people. She was pulled aside briefly by the woman who guided her, who whispered warnings, reminding her to stay low, to observe, to remain calm. She nodded, though her hands shook. Her mind raced with questions. What would happen when the two groups clashed? Would the chief be able to protect his people? And what would her role be in this sudden surge of danger? She realized that she had become more than a spectator. Survival in this world required participation, awareness, to courage she was only beginning to discover within herself. The night deepened. Stars scattered across the sky like distant sparks. The rival group emerged from the shadows, a moving wall of figures, their intentions clear. The desert seemed to close in around them, amplifying the tension in the air. She could see the sharp glint of weapons, hear the whisper of movement in the sand, and feel the tightening coil of anticipation within the camp. The chief moved among his warriors, issuing final commands, his presence a steady anchor amidst the rising chaos. She felt the weight of the moment. the undeniable truth that the coming hours would test every skill, every instinct, every ounce of courage she possessed. The desert, the tribe, the chief, all demanded more than endurance. They demanded insight, action, and the ability to remain calm when danger was imminent. Every heartbeat seemed to echo through the night, a drumbeat of fear, anticipation, and the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. The rival group advanced closer, and the tension between the two sides was palpable. The chief's warriors formed a line, a living wall of strength and vigilance. She could see the fear and determination in their eyes, the same emotions reflected in her own. She realized that she was now woven into this story, part of a web of loyalty, danger, and human ambition that had been building long before she arrived. And as the first shouts echoed across the desert, carried by the wind and the firelight, she knew that the moment of reckoning had come. The desert held its breath as the two forces converged, shadows twisting and merging in the fading light. She felt her pulse spike, her body tense, every sense alert. The chief stood at the center, calm and commanding, a figure of authority and power that radiated control even in the face of imminent violence. She could sense the threads of the story pulling tight, every decision, every glance, every movement leading towards something inevitable. And in that moment, she understood that the climax was not just the coming battle, it was the collision of lives, of power, of choices made and consequences yet to be revealed. The desert was no longer simply a backdrop. It was a force shaping events, demanding survival, demanding courage, and demanding more than she had ever given. She could do nothing but watch, wait, and steel herself, knowing that the coming hours would test everything she thought she knew about life, loyalty, and the harsh, unforgiving rules of the desert and the tribe she now belonged to. If you like, I can continue from here with the final section, where the actual climax begins, focusing on the battle, the chief's strategies, and the heroine's critical role while keeping the suspense high until the resolution. The desert air was thick with tension as the rival group approached, but the chief's calm presence radiated through the camp, steadying the hearts of those around him. She stood at the edge of the circle, her hands tight around the water bowl she had carried earlier, watching the shadows of approaching figures stretch long across the sand. The wind carried the scent of dust, sweat, and anticipation. Each breath she took filled with the knowledge that the coming moments would define everything: loyalty, courage, and survival. The warriors moved as one, silent, disciplined, a wall of readiness against the approaching threat. The chief's eyes scanned every face, reading movements, gauging reactions, and commanding without words. She could feel the weight of his authority, the careful balance of strategy and instinct that had kept the tribe safe through years of hardship. And in that, she began to understand the full measure of his strength, not just in his skill with a blade or his commanding voice, but in the trust he inspired, the confidence he instilled in those around him. The first clash came suddenly. The rival warriors surged forward, a blur of movement across the desert floor. Dust rose like a storm around them, and the cries of men filled the air, sharp, raw, and unrelenting. The chief's warriors responded instantly, moving with precision, intercepting attacks, and forcing the rivals back step by step. She felt her pulse quicken, her breath caught between fear and fascination, as the raw power of survival unfolded before her eyes. This was not just a battle for land or pride, it was a test of endurance, skill, and willpower, and every movement mattered. She was drawn forward by instinct, carrying water to the injured, offering small aid where she could, her hands shaking but steady. Her role felt insignificant against the larger tide of violence, yet she understood that every act of support mattered, every small gesture a thread in the fabric of survival. And as she moved, she noticed the warriors watching her, some with recognition, others with quiet curiosity. She had become part of this world, woven into its struggles, and she could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down, demanding courage she did not yet know she fully possessed. The battle shifted and swirled like sand in a storm. Warriors fell, dust and sweat mixing with the cries of pain and triumph. The rival group was relentless, their strategy cunning, but the chief's command was unwavering. He moved with a precision that seemed almost effortless, every motion calculated, every decision exact. She watched him dodge and strike, intervene and direct, and for the first time, she understood the full measure of the man she had awakened beside. He was not just a ruler or a warrior. He was the pulse of this tribe, the anchor that held them together when chaos threatened to overwhelm. Hours passed in what felt like moments. The sun dipped lower, painting the desert in gold and crimson, shadows stretching and twisting across the ground. The rival group began to falter, exhaustion and strategy turning the tide. She saw warriors she had only just begun to understand move with quiet courage, their loyalty to the chief and the tribe unwavering despite fear and fatigue, and she realized in the midst of the storm of violence that she had learned something vital. Survival here was not only about strength. It was about unity, trust, and the ability to act even when terror pressed close to the skin. Finally, the tide turned. The rival warriors, beaten and scattered, retreated into the desert, leaving behind the echo of their shouts and the dust of their passage. The chief's warriors stood, exhausted but unbroken, their eyes reflecting relief, pride, and the unspoken bonds that had been tested and proven. She exhaled, her chest aching with tension and adrenaline, and in that moment, she felt the first flicker of understanding. She had survived the desert, yes, but now she had survived a world that demanded more than endurance. She had survived courage, loyalty, and the storm of human ambition. The chief approached her, his expression calm but intense, and she felt that magnetic tension pull again, stronger than ever. He knelt briefly, placing a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of both acknowledgement and protection. Though his words were still foreign, the meaning was clear. She had proven herself, in whatever small way she could, and she was now truly part of this world. She felt a thrill of fear and relief, a recognition that the story of survival had shifted from desperation to purpose. The woman who had guided her through the camp all this time approached, her eyes soft but watchful. She offered a slight nod, a recognition of endurance, and perhaps even respect. The bonds between them, fragile and unspoken, had deepened through shared danger and quiet courage. The camp began to settle, the firelight flickering across tired faces, the desert stretching beyond as if it had witnessed and judged the events without favor or prejudice. That night, the chief called a gathering. The tribe circled around the fire, and though the battle had ended, the unspoken lessons remained. Loyalty had been tested, courage proven, and the fragile balance of leadership reaffirmed. She understood that this world would never be simple, never safe, but it was real, and she had a place within it. She listened as the chief spoke, his tone measured, commanding, yet underlined with a quiet gravity that spoke of both authority and responsibility. Every word, every gesture resonated with meaning, and she realized that she was beginning to understand not just the language but the way of life here. Over the next days, the camp returned to its rhythms, but the memory of the battle lingered like a shadow. She helped the injured, assisted in preparing supplies, and began to participate more fully in daily life. She discovered skills she had not known she possessed, the ability to read subtle signs, to anticipate danger, to move quietly and efficiently. The chief observed her, sometimes silently, sometimes with quiet instruction, and she began to recognize the depth of his care and vigilance, a careful blend of authority and protection that had saved the tribe countless times. She also learned more about the subplots that had simmered beneath the surface. Rivalries among the warriors had been eased by the shared danger, but old grudges remained. Alliances shifted, respect had to be continually earned. And even in victory, there was the constant awareness that peace was fragile, temporary, and demanded vigilance. She saw the subtle maneuvers of those who sought influence, the quiet gestures of loyalty, and the unspoken agreements that bound the tribe together. In this, she understood a truth she had not known before. Leadership was as much about managing hearts and minds as it was about wielding power or skill. The chief's presence became a constant lesson for her, a template for courage, strategy, and wisdom. She watched him make decisions, calm arguments, and face challenges with a combination of authority and empathy that was almost impossible to articulate. And she began to see the man behind the warrior, the weight of responsibility, the depth of history, the scars of past battles, and the quiet humanity that had drawn her in from the moment she had awoken in this strange world. One evening, as the sun sank low and the desert air cooled, the chief approached her alone. The camp had quieted, the fire casting long shadows across the sand, and for a moment the world seemed suspended. He spoke, and though she could not understand the words fully, the meaning was unmistakable. There was gratitude, acknowledgement, and something deeper, a bond forged through shared danger and respect. She felt a connection she had never known, a recognition that she was no longer just a survivor, no longer just a stranger in a foreign land. She was part of a life that demanded courage, loyalty, and heartened she had earned her place in the days that followed. The tribe rebuilt, healed, and prepared for the next challenges the desert might bring. She worked alongside them, learned their ways, and became more fully herself within this harsh, beautiful world. She began to understand that survival was never just about endurance or escape. It was about adaptation, understanding, and embracing the complexity of life around her. The desert had given her life once, but the tribe, the chief, and the world they inhabited gave her something more: a purpose, a home, and a sense of belonging she had never known she needed. The chief remained by her side, always steady, always vigilant, and in that, she discovered a trust she could rely on. Their bond was not simple, and the tension between them still held sparks of fear and fascination. But it had evolved into something powerful. She understood that she had not only survived the desert and the battle, but had stepped into a world where courage, loyalty, and heart defined life. And in that understanding, she found strength, peace, and a deep, quiet satisfaction as the stars appeared overhead. Scattered like diamonds across the black desert sky, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the heat and despair of the desert to the firelight and shadows of the tribe, from helplessness to strength, from fear to belonging, the desert remained harsh and relentless. But now it was a partner in her life, a reminder of survival, resilience, and the enduring power of courage. The chief approached, and without words, their hands met. It was a simple gesture, yet heavy with meaning, trust, acknowledgement, and the unspoken promise of partnership. She understood now that life in this world was never easy, never predictable, but it was real, vital, and full of purpose. The desert had almost claimed her, but here, in the firelight and shadows, among warriors and loyalty, she had found her place, her strength. In her story, the night stretched on, peaceful now, and she felt the pulse of the world around her, the tribe, the chief. The desert itself fall intertwined in a balance of respect, courage, and survival. She had awakened once as a stranger in a harsh world, but now she was home. She was the wife of a man who commanded respect, the protector and leader of his people. And she had discovered that strength was not just in surviving, but in choosing to live fully and fiercely in a world that demanded everything. As the firelight flickered and the stars shone above, she closed her eyes for the first time in days. Feeling the pulse of life and the steady rhythm of courage and loyalty that defined her new world, she was no longer just a survivor of the desert. She was a part of its story, of the tribe's story, and of her own. And in that, she understood something that the harsh sun, the endless sand, and the trials of the past could never have taught her. Survival was only the beginning. Life, love, and purpose waited in the heart of the desert, and she had finally found her place within it. The night settled softly, the desert wind carrying away the last echoes of battle, leaving behind a world tempered by courage, respect, and endurance. She opened her eyes, and for the first time, she could see the path forward, uncertain, challenging, but undeniably hers. Her story had begun in desperation and fear, but it ended here. In strength and belonging, under the vast, the unyielding sky of the desert, where life and survival met in perfect, fragile harmony, top of form, bottom of form.